Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to our session today, Reaching Net Zero. How can financial institutions achieve their climate objective and finance the transition? I'm so pleased to be here with you in this special COP28 with so many, objective and targets to reach. So today, I'm happy to, let's say, be the master of ceremony of this panel that will be introduced by the presentation of the outcome report of the LSFI working group on climate measurement and reporting, and then a fantastic panel moderated by Isabelle Della, CEO of Lux Flag. She will introduce you Lux Flag in a second. Stephen Nolan, Managing Director of UNDP FC4S, Financial Center for Sustainability, for who doesn't know the acronym, Head of Secretariat at the CIF. Then we have Kate Levick, Associate Director, Sustainable Finance Lead at E3G, and Stephen O'Driscoll, Head of Environment, Climate and Social Policy at the European Investment Bank. I'm Nicoletta Centofanti. I'm the CEO of the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative. I have to apologize for my terrible voice today. It's a bit froggy. I just got a cold on the plane, unfortunately. So this event is organized by the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative and by Lux Flag. So I let Isabelle briefly introduce what Lux Flag is. Thank you, Isabelle. Isabelle, you can introduce. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So Lux Flag is a Luxembourg Luxembourg Finance Labeling Agency. It's an independent and international non-profit association that was created in Luxembourg in July 2006 by 7 public and private partners, for which you have ABBL, ADA, ALFI, the European Investment Bank, Luxembourg Stock Exchange, Luxembourg for Finance, and the government of Luxembourg. And recently, in 2023, the ACA, the Association d'Assurance, joined us as well as the 8th charter member. So Lux Flag aims to promote the raising of capital for the sustainable finance sector by awarding a recognizable label to eligible financial products. So Lux Flag labels are recognized for their high standards and rigorous measurements. So a Lux Flag label is quite a signal, a unique tool at the disposal of the financial industry that they can use to showcase and highlight their sustainability, ESG, and impact credentials. So Lux Flag has at the moment 7 labels, 4 impact labels, and 3 ESG sustainability transition labels. And for each of them, there are specific criteria that we are revising them quite periodically. The validity period for a label that is granted to a financial product is 1 year, and we are also carefully monitoring in between what the financial product that receives the label is doing, really to make sure that we can guarantee that they are compliant with our criteria per the label and the exclusion policy as well. So we are also recognized as we are one of the few labeling agencies being independent, and our labels can be used internationally. And so this is where investors are really pleased with the sustainability preferences that they can showcase when they choose a specific labeled product.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. The LSFI is a Luxembourg coordinating entity, so we coordinate all relevant sustainable finance actors, and our mission is to raise awareness and help the financial sector transition. And when I mean coordinating entity, it means that we try to work, of course, with all the actors that are fundamental to achieve the climate objective, this fundamental transition of our economy towards sustainability. So not only the financial sector, which is our core target, but also inclusive finance, fintech, academia, and of course, NGOs and civil society. So basically, we try to do this with the strategy that we have drafted and implement. So we are the ones who has drafted the Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Strategy that is composed of 3 pillars that represents our action plan. Awareness and promotion, unlocking potential and measuring progress. I will focus now on unlocking potential, under which we aim basically to support the sector with guidance and toolkit. Among those different activities that we run, we have launched last year 4 working groups. So we started with education and training. We just kick off the one on ESG data, but today is the climate day. So we will speak about our climate measurement and reporting tool outcome that was released a couple of months ago. So of course, we all know the fundamental objective of the Paris Agreement and the fundamental, let's say, role that the financial sector has to play. We started in 2021 with a climate scenario analysis with PACTA, and in 2023 we launched this working group. What did we do? The objective was to assess tools and methodology for financial institutions to achieve the so famous climate transition. We convened 12 members across sectors that were trying to, let's say, analyze those tools and methodologies to really provide a concrete recommendations to the sector. The scope. Of course, when we speak about climate, we have to be aware that climate is one of the aspects of, let's say, the environmental dimension, and that climate has different type of, let's say, shades. So we just focused on climate mitigation and emission reduction, and we targeted all financial institutions, so insurance companies, asset managers, credit institutions, supervised, established, or registered in Luxembourg. But I'm sure that what I will say today is useful for any type of institutions worldwide. Key fundamental thing that the working group members have done, it's unique, nobody else has done this before, is to establish the key net steps to achieve net zero. I'm conscious of time, I'll try to speak the least as possible, not to, let's say, annoy the audience, but I do strongly invite you to read in detail the outcome report. The 6 next steps are measuring emission, selecting a transition pathway, setting targets, taking actions, disclosing, and monitoring progress. I challenge you to see whether somebody else has done this. So first, let's start with the definition. What is net zero? We speak a lot about this term. I'm not a scientist, but I'll try to do my best. Basically, it's the balancing of global emission generated by the human being, of course, CO2 emissions, balanced by the removal in an anthropogenic way of these CO2 emissions. Of course, emissions can be generated by fossil fuels, but also deforestation, land use change. I'm not an expert. I leave this to the expert. And we know that the temperature has already increased quite a bit so far. So, without taking too much time in explaining the next steps to the steps to net zero, I'll move quickly to the tools that then in the end have been analyzed. In alphabetical order, the working group has analyzed the ACT tool, assessing low carbon transition, the PACTA tool, the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment that many countries at COP has used already, the PCAF, Partnership for Accounting Financials, the Science-Based Target Initiative, and the Transition Pathway Initiatives. All these tools are open source, transparent, run by non-for-profit associations, and of course, we focus more on methodologies rather than individual data providers. The working group members assessed the data quality, the data coverage of each of these, the tool usability and accessibility, the outputs and reporting. What on top of it has been done by the members is to look on how those tools could have been used to respond to the regulatory requirements that are such a burden for our financial institutions, and at which level of maturity financial institutions should have been to use these tools. So let's go quickly through the tools, if the clicker works. Can somebody pass the slides for me? Okay, it's working. So first of all, PCAF. I'll be fast, okay? So Please, the tool provider, apologies, everything is contained in detail in the outcome. So PICA is the standard for measuring carbon emission, so financed emission through lending and investment. It's widely accepted by financial institutions to measure Scope 3 Category 15, meaning financed emissions. It's simple and flexible and provide a methodology to easily report and disclose. We have to underline that it doesn't validate the information disclosed and it doesn't provide, let's say, much guidance, though it supports the different signatories. Going back to the next steps, the working group looked at how this methodology can respond to next steps, to the net zero steps, sorry. So PCAV, you'll see, provide support to measure emission, target, taking actions, and disclosing. SBTI, very briefly, it's the targeting setting tool for financial institutions, and it provides a clear, defined path to reduce emission in line with the Paris Agreement. However, it doesn't assess progress towards these targets and doesn't cover yet several activities such in the insurance underwriting and capital markets underwriting. So going back to the net zero step, selecting transition pathway benchmark, setting targets, taking action, and disclosing can be achieved by using SBTI. PACTA is a climate scenario analysis tool that has been used also by many countries to run coordinated climate scenario analysis, including Luxembourg. And it facilitates, for sure, transparency and accountability. However, it focused on several sectors, therefore it might be perceived as a limited asset coverage and doesn't focus on specific guidance to financial institutions on how to improve their portfolios. However, PACTA responds to selecting transition pathways, setting targets, taking actions, and disclosing. TPI is a climate progress monitoring data tool. It's a global initiative. It enables investors to assess against international agreed benchmarks, a company performance. However, it only covers, for now at least, a limited universe of firms. So today, when we did the analysis, 600 firms were covered. According to the members, TPI is suitable to selecting transition pathway benchmarks, setting targets, taking actions, and monitoring progress. Last tool, I promise, ACT, is a progress assessment framework. It's a unique tool. It started its pilot this last year for financial institutions, and it builds on SBTI target setting as well as PCAF for carbon accounting. Moreover, it's comparable to TPI and it's TCFD aligned. Sorry for the acronym, but I'm sure the audience will understand what I'm saying. However, it's only available for the time being for companies in the real economy. Going back to the net zero steps, ACT has been, let's say, considered suitable by the working group members for taking actions and monitoring progress. The conclusion, recommendation of the working group members that I guess everybody was wondered, and PCAF is a very suitable and comprehensive tool to support financial institutions. SBTI as well is a very suitable and comprehensive tool. PCAF, of course, for measuring progress, the first step, as we've seen, as well as SBTI to support target setting and setting benchmarks. PACTA is a useful tool as it offers helpful information, but it still lacks for relevant functionalities considering the current needs of financial institutions, and TPI is a tool with significant potential, in particular as a data provider, but it suffers for limited coverage at the moment. Last but not least, ACT is a methodology that has been considered with a lot of potential, especially to track progress, but it's a stage that is too early to be recommended. This is a fantastic I believe it's the key outcome of the working group members, the net zero steps and the tools, how they can support financial institutions achieving their climate objectives. So what is happening next, right? Well, as I mentioned, all the work the working group members have done is for Luxembourg financial institutions, and as I mentioned, LSFI is the coordinating entity that is trying to support financial institutions. So we are taking the recommendation of the working group members, namely implement PCAF as first priority, as key first steps, as I said, is measuring emissions, and then a second priority, SBTI, identifying benchmark and setting targets. So in the next year, we will assess the best way forward to support financial institutions using and implementing PCAF, and in the short, let's say, as a second step, we'll do the same with SBTI. So we will host a public sessions in January, presenting the report and very much detailed, and a detailed in-depth session on how to use PCAF. So I do invite you to come to Luxembourg and join us in person. And of course, last but not least, I would underline that, of course, I've been short. I didn't have much time to present the report, but of course we remain open to feedback, and the working group members are very happy to be challenged and being asked for questions on their recommendation. So I pause now here. I hope it was not too fast and not too long as well. And I'm open to take any question before leaving to the panel discussion, of course. There is a question in the audience.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, for this very thorough presentation. I have a question with regards to why did you choose this set of tools? So there is a large range of tools, initiative, instruments out there. Why these 5 and not something else? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. So everyone would have wondered why we didn't, let's say, look at the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Disclosure, or GFANS, you know, that was launched in COP26 in Glasgow. So the combination of all the alliances for net zero. Of course, both TCFD and GFANS were the starting point. So the working group members have looked at those initiatives and looked at the TCFD framework and tried to see what they were recommending. But we felt it was very important to look at transparent, as I said, open source tools run by not-for-profit associations. And these 5 that I'm presenting are the ones that also are mentioned by TCFD, are mentioned by the GFANS Net Zero Alliances. But we really wanted to provide a recommendation that doesn't exist so far in the market to give clarity to financial institutions that may get lost with all the tools that are offered in the market. When I say not-for-profit, it doesn't mean that these tools are free of charge. To cover their running costs, they may ask for a fee to support as well financial institutions. It means that they are meant not to be for-profit. So, of course, we looked at what is relevant and international, but I really wanted to, let's say, put the priority and the attention on, let's say, internationally recognized methodologies that are transparent.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Stephen from the UNDP, and I really enjoyed our presentation. In terms of its use within the Luxembourg financial services ecosystem, how are you pushing it out? Is it through workshops, or how are you keeping your members updated on this, on these developments?
So, of course, before pushing, we are assessing. So the working group members did a first analysis, really cherry-picking a few financial institutions and looking how much they were using those tools. In the study that we will present on the 14th December, we did a thorough analysis of Luxembourg domiciled institutions to see where they stand, and we realized that we can work a lot with the financial institutions to helping them, let's say, embark on this journey. As I mentioned, unfortunately, I'm sorry, it was very brief, the last slide. So, first of all, we felt we should publicly present in detail this report. So, an hour and a half, very technical for the ones who are interested in the technicalities of each different tools. Everything is written in the report. So, and then we will do what we call masterclass, because it's a very nice term. So we will provide a bit of theory with the PCAF Secretariat and 2 to 3 case studies across asset classes. Of course, we don't just want to show how great these tools are, but also how challenging they are. What are, let's say, the obstacles that financial institutions may face, and also to be, as LSFI, a friend, a partner, and understand then how with them to overcome those challenges. So I don't know yet the answer. We've done several interviews. We are developing, let's say, our understanding of the challenges to implement PCAF to be ready to support financial institutions. But we will learn from them. We want to hear from financial institutions what are the challenges, and then thanks to the LSFI and our kind founders and supporters, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Environment, Climate and Biodiversity in Luxembourg, we will try to see if we can have some means to support financial institutions in a way or the other. But unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball now, so I don't know what will be the ask by financial institutions. For sure, I want to see PCAF signatories from Luxembourg highly increase, sorry. Thank you for the question, Stephen.
I have a question, yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. Many of the tools that you've described were kind of reference points for us as well when we were looking at our approach for Paris alignment of counterparties, so looking beyond the projects. And especially for the financial institutions there, we looked at SBTI and TPI. I know SBTI did an extensive consultation last year as well, and they came out with a new approach for financial intermediaries. Have you seen the market shifting materially to adopt that? And is that really the reason behind the recommendation here for it to be the second priority?
Thank you very much for this very important question. I would say that the market is a sounding board, but we really relied on what these methodologies are doing, right? So the fact, of course, that SBTI is so much taking the pace and trying to increase the asset classes coverage, working more and more with financial institutions. Up to 5,000 companies have set targets, or had said that they would have set targets, and 400 financial institutions, if I'm not mistaken, for sure. But I would say that the working group members looked more at what was, let's say, the tool capability and where it really was necessary to reach net zero, since measuring emission, basically PCAF, is the only methodology available to do that. And SBTI is the, let's say, the most complete, I would say, but I don't want to offend any tool provider. But the working group members really felt that it was the one that could best support the financial institutions in selecting transition pathway benchmark and setting targets across asset classes, across sectors. And that's why it has been recommended as second priority for us. If there are no more questions, I thank you very much again for this very relevant question. I do again invite you to read the outcome report, and I leave the floor to our fantastic moderator, Isabel Delas, that will moderate our panelists.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for this great presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear delegates, good morning. I'm very honored to moderate the LuxFlag and LSFI panel discussion at COP28. As part of our shared mission to promote sustainable finance and responsible investment, LuxFlag and LSFI are pleased to join the EIB and the delegations of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands with our side events. So its main objective is to shed light on key challenges faced by investors and multilateral development banks for reaching net zero, and how financial institutions are evolving to enable the financing of the transition. LuxFlag, just a few words about LuxFlag again. LuxFlag has a unique climate finance label that was created in 2006. So LuxFlag has always been a pioneer into that field as well. And we are also the unique, still now, labeling agency out of 7 in Europe, having such kind of diverse offer of labels. So we are very much part on this, let's say, impact investing sector, while now most of the things are moving to the climate transition finance. So today is more about that. So please join me in welcoming our 3 exceptional experts to delve into this climate transition finance. So I'm pleased to welcome you and to introduce you Kate Levick, who leads E3G's activities on sustainable finance as Associate Director. So she's working with public and private finance stakeholders to support political decisions that enable financing of the global transition to climate safety. Kate is also the co-head of the Secretariat to the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. She sits on the advisory panel to the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. She is also the policy work stream of the UK's Green Technical Advisory Group, which advises government in relation to the UK's green taxonomy. Thank you, Kate, to join us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So Stephen Nolan is Managing Director of UNDP FC4S, that Nicolette so briefly presented, and Head of Secretariat of UNDP Sustainable Insurance Forum. And FC4S now has 41 members. And thank you, Stephen, to join us. And Stephen also, Aude Wiscol, who is Head of Climate, Environment, and Social Policy, Safeguards and Quality Management Department at the EIB since 2020. Stephen also joined the EIB in 2008 and previously was the head of the Air, Maritime and Innovative Transport Division. So he's overseeing policy development, standards and the application of procedures at a time when the EIB is evolving into the climate bank of the European Union. So thank you, Stephen, to join us as well. So I would like now to start as an introduction. So if each of you could you please give us your perspective on our financial institution and multilateral one like the EIB are contributing to achieving their climate objectives and finance the transition. Could you please also present a concrete example of such commitment? So if I start with you, Kate.
Hi, well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel today. It's a real honour. So I lead finance work at E3G, which is a climate politics think tank, headquartered in London, but working in Brussels, in Berlin, in Washington, DC, and working on the international level as well as at national level. And our work on finance spans the whole gamut of public and private finance. So we actually work very closely with multilateral development banks, including the EIB, and have been very, pleased to help to work to support the EIB on that journey that it's been on to become Europe's climate bank. Equally, we, work on private finance and how that can be sort of restructured to support climate transition as well. And I think part of the reason probably that I got the kind invitation to come today is because of my role on the UK's Transition Plan Task Force. Now, that was set up by the UK at COP26 to support the market as it moved towards what's becoming rapidly a new norm, which is to create and disclose climate transition plans. So part of the process for market firms of doing that involves absolutely getting to grips with the kind of tools that have been discussed today in the report that's been put out, and working through these questions, which are most suitable, which gives me what I need, and which give me that sort of rounded support that we really need to, at a strategic level, pivot our firm to be ready for the climate transition. So, I mean, where to start on a concrete example. We've seen so much of this, but I think I've been very heartened over the year and a half, or just over a year and a half, I suppose, that we've so far been running the Transition Plan Task Force, to see how, even in that time, how fast that space has moved. That includes looking at finance institutions and private finance institutions and the level of understanding and acceptance of their role in climate transition, what they need to do and what might be expected of them. I'm not surprised to see that PCAF came out very strongly in the report as being really important in setting out a robust methodology for measuring financed emissions. A few days before COP started, the Bank of International Settlements has put out a consultation on a climate disclosure requirement for banks, which again is very clear that they would expect banks to disclose financed emissions. I mean, this is something that a couple of years ago, financial institutions were still thinking, do we really have to do this? Does it make sense? We have no idea how, and we're in a very different place already at this time on that. I'd just briefly say one more thing about the approach that we take in the Transition Plan Task Force, which has been creating a best practice disclosure framework for firms. So it's how you talk about what you've been doing, which is a slightly different question to how you do the calculations using tools such as those calculated today. TPT is recommending that when firms disclose their strategy for climate transition, they are looking at their net zero targets and their decarbonisation, which is very much overall where these tools focus, but also in the spirit of that bigger framework put out by the working group, also that firms are talking about how they are managing their climate-related risks and opportunities, and how they are contributing to the overall societal economic transition. And the reason for that last part is that we don't want to accidentally end up with a paper decarbonisation situation where firms do bring their financed emissions or their direct emissions in the real economy down to zero, but all they've done is sell some assets, and those emissions are still out there. They're just not owned and shown on that firm's balance sheet. We're looking for actual phase outs, phase down, and getting to a point where the whole of society has made this transition.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I think this is something we all share. So, Stephen, would you like to present your view on that?
There's two Stevens, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe I'll jump in first, if that's okay. Look, first and foremost, Isabel, thank you for having me here today. On behalf of the UNDP, we're delighted, thrilled to be with our colleagues in Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative. Interestingly, it was the Luxembourg government that provided the seed capital to actually establish the Financial Centres for Sustainability on the back of the G7 recommendations a few years ago. And we started with 11 members, and now we're at 41, so we're thrilled, and that wouldn't have been possible without the Luxembourg government. I think just listening to Nicoletta today, it's obvious the amount of detail that Luxembourg Sustainable Finance Initiative is now really driving within the ecosystem of Luxembourg. And that's really important, given even though Luxembourg as a country is small in the European context, its financial services centre is one of the leaders. And it's great to see what Nicoletta was saying, and as Kate was saying about PCAF, and sometimes in this area, I feel like a bit of an amateur therapist, dealing with CEOs of banks, asset manager funds, and sometimes it's just where do we go to get the information in a way that can actually take it on board into our team. So seeing Nicoletta's presentation today, I can see that being used beyond Luxembourg's borders, which I think is fantastic as well and must be congratulated. From our perspective, we go launch tomorrow formally the Financial Centres for Sustainability Network State of Play report, where we analysed over the last year the progress of our members against the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, and it's a really positive story. We first did this in 2019, so we can see significant growth, we can see significant change, and one of those areas is in around what financial institutions are doing. And back to Kate's point, it has been a remarkable journey the last few years. I've been doing this for a decade, and I can remember 10 years ago you were still talking about corporate social responsibility. Now you're talking about strategy, deployment of capital, risk, compliance at the C-suite level, at the board level. And so that's what we're seeing, Isabel, a lot of growth in this area. We're seeing from the report as well a real eagerness to be very transparent about those commitments and actually demonstrate and showcase how those commitments are going to be met. And that's obviously trying to get away from greenwashing tag. An example we're seeing in Ireland, actually, in Ireland's largest bank, AIB, is that they announced a few weeks ago that they've hit their 10 billion euro climate fund target a few years earlier than they expected. And they're now increasing that to 30 billion between now and 2030, obviously trying to help Ireland's net zero achievements. Interestingly, within that, Isabel, and I think something that sometimes maybe we miss in some of these conversations, is the Irish economy, like a lot of European economies, is based around SMEs. And it's not all the large financial institutions and asset managers, it's how these SMEs, which is the lifeblood of the European economy, how are they actually transitioning? And what support are they getting? Because obviously the concern could be in a few years' time that they're no longer bankable if they're not doing the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions from a disclosure perspective. So we're also seeing within our members, it's not that they're just increasing the amounts of capital to lend or finance, they're also trying to support their clients at a talent perspective and how can they upskill around, say, disclosure. So it's really interesting. It's quite a fascinating space to watch right now, but things are moving a lot quicker than they were a few years ago.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. So, Stephen, what's your point of view from the EIB?
Thanks, Isabel. Really delighted to be here today and give you a few thoughts from the EIB group, which of course includes both the bank, the EU Climate Bank, and the EIF. And Stephen's point there about SMEs and proportionality and so on is very important for them. So it's really interesting to see what you've come up with there. I mean, our climate objectives, which are essentially our contribution to financing transition, are really enshrined in a number of commitments that we made going back to 2019 now. So firstly, there was the energy lending policy, which said we were going to step away from financing unabated fossil fuel projects. And after that came out, we set ourselves 3 additional targets, which were that we would dedicate 50%, at least 50% of our financing to climate action and environmental sustainability projects, which in EU taxonomy terms means that they must be making a substantial contribution. We also said that we would support $1 trillion of investment during this critical decade, so out to 2030. And then the third one was that everything we do would be Paris aligned. In 2020, we decided that we probably needed to try and operationalize these commitments, which is not easy. So we did that essentially through 4 angles, and this was really off the back of the EU Green Deal and the Sustainable Finance Framework in Europe. We kind of laid out clearly in the Climate Bank roadmap how we were going to support green business in all of the focus areas of the Green Deal. So that's through from energy efficiency to zero pollution to farm to fork and so on. So we looked at how we might kind of develop different financial products for these. Secondly, we set out this very, very clear Paris alignment framework where from a sectoral point of view, we said what we could and couldn't support based on whether we thought it was consistent with a low carbon pathway and a climate resilient pathway. Thirdly, the just transition angle. So we said that we wanted to do all this, cognizant of leaving no one and no place behind. And then lastly, we wanted to do this all in a way that was strategically coherent, which goes back to the regulatory framework and some of the things that you picked up on there. We've just done a midterm stock take of this, and we're doing rather well, we think. So we've reached our target effectively 2 years early. So last year was 58% of our lending was green. And the rest of it was all Paris aligned because that's the other 42%. And a lot of that is in renewable energy, about 12 billion, transport, etc. So these are quite substantial sums. We're on track on the trillion, and everything that we do is Paris aligned essentially by the end of 2021. So we achieved our target there. So these are all concrete commitments, but there's another couple of other things I just wanted to mention. We every project that we do a cost-benefit analysis, and an important component of that is adopting the right shadow cost of carbon. And so looking at all the evidence back in 2021, we set a profile moving forward that goes from 80 euros per tonne out to 800 euros per tonne in 2050. So if you think about that, the way that works, that penalises projects that are highly emitting and obviously benefits those that are not. So that's a really important aspect for us moving forward. And then secondly, as I mentioned earlier, the path framework, which is about looking beyond the project to the counterparty or the borrower and their wider activities. And we said that they need to produce decarbonisation plans, and this is not only corporates and public sector borrowers, but it's also financial intermediaries as well, which comes back to your point. So they have to come up with credible 2030 targets for us to be able to work with them, and they must kind of outline a plan for getting to net zero by 2050. So these are our commitments. We were, of course, financing a lot of green activity before we set these commitments, 25% or so on. So we're really pleased that our commitments are we're showing good progress against them.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. It's really impressive what the EU Climate Bank is really doing and leading the path, I would say, in Europe and beyond. So thank you. So Kate, now I think what's important thing is what is your definition of transition finance? What are the regulatory initiatives that support the development of climate transition plans? I think we need to start from the beginning, the definition.
Sure. So governments around the world have, over the last couple of years, really been turning their attention to this question of what is transition finance. And this is being debated at many levels, and many jurisdictions are looking to create their own transition finance policy frameworks. Now, that marks a real shift. Until quite recently, we were all talking about green finance or sustainable finance, and of course we still are. But even when those agendas were initiated, there were a few little voices talking about, what about how to get there? And I think those voices sort of became louder and louder, and really I think the sort of sector as a whole has taken a turn towards thinking, right, so now that we've talked about what is green, we know what we want to get to, how do we work out how to get there, and how do we finance this transition? And so that's a question that's obviously happening at the level of every individual firm, but it's also something that's being asked by national governments in terms of how it's going to pay for its own national transition to meet its binding targets and its Paris targets. And many sort of international multilateral forums have been looking at the question as well. So even at COP last year, there were an absolutely extraordinary number of reports published by different groupings, whether it's the EU's International Platform on Sustainable Finance, whether it's the OECD, many, many others, all basically defining transition finance, saying what's in it, starting to talk about what kind of tools to use. And actually, because this is such a current question with everybody thinking about it, part of the challenge is even to consolidate and converge on shared definitions. Personally, I think that the framework that GFAN's consulted on recently, and which I think they're about to launch the sort of final outcome of, contains some quite helpful framing for different kinds of transition finance. So, of course, we have the funding that's needed to take economic activities that are currently not sustainable and make them sustainable and fit for a Paris-aligned world. And that's what most people think about when they think of transition finance. But there are also other types. It's very important to invest in innovation and climate solutions, because we know that for many industries, we don't actually yet have the technologies we need or have those technologies at scale. And so actually investment in those is crucial. We also don't think about some of the things that we need to stop doing, and that somehow we need to make that happen. So everybody worries about carbon lock-in and sort of long-lived infrastructure. Actually, if you're going to phase that down early, there's a cost to that. And so part of transition finance is, in fact, financing fossil phase-out and phase-out of other unsustainable activities as well. So there are, a range of different types that sit under that. And I think, as the discussion continues, we're gradually getting to the point where there's a bit more convergence around transition finance not being one simple thing. It's not only about setting your net zero or 2050 or earlier target and moving towards that. It's also about all these different kinds of things that will need to be paid for along the way to get there. So in the voluntary space, there are a great number of organisations, that have been working on this for a while. I could be here for a while reeling off a lot of acronyms if I name them all. I've mentioned GFAN's work, which I think is a really valuable contribution, particularly on the phase-out side. The Climate Bonds Initiative has also been playing a very important role to help sort of define transition finance and start to really elaborate, standards and expectations for transition-linked tools, most obviously sort of transition-linked bonds. I mean, I'm slightly biased because I used to work there, but I think the work of CDP, which was formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, has been important too, because CDP has for many years been the world's largest voluntary climate disclosure framework, and it has now 26,000 companies from around the world annually disclosing climate information to investors. They have transitioned, if you like, their disclosure questionnaire so that companies which are disclosing through CDP are now effectively disclosing their transition plan through that. So, the voluntary practice has been coming on very rapidly. What we are seeing, though, at the same time, increasingly, is a pivot. And it's a pivot from voluntary practice to regulation, because there's enough practice in the market, enough momentum, and it's understood that this is possible and not necessarily overly burdensome and costly, which governments sometimes worry about. There's enough momentum there that the regulators are starting to think, actually, isn't this our job to set some of the standards and expectations for this? So we're effectively seeing more of that happening as well. In the context of transition plans, the UK government went pretty early with its announcement at COP28 that it would require listed companies and financial firms to disclose transition plans by 2023. That's why the Transition Plan Task Force was created, to help firms know how to do that. The EU has also moved very quickly on this, and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ESRS, as part of a wide range of sustainability disclosure requirements, include effectively comprehensive expectations on transition plans. But we're seeing expectations coming out from around the world: Australia, Singapore. The list is long in terms of countries that are putting measures like this in place. So I think that pivot to the official sector and regulation is also important. Of course, when we have a lot of countries trying to put in regulation at once, we have that risk of regulatory fragmentation, which firms, multinational firms at least, hate so much. So I think it's very, very important that this is also being discussed in the international forums to try and converge around international norms. And we've seen discussions on transition finance and transition plans in the last year at the G20, in the G7. I mentioned the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. We've seen the central banks discussing this through the Network for Greening the Financial System. We see work streams on this in the Financial Stability Board, in the IOSCO, which is the Multilateral Association of Stock Exchange Regulators. So this is something that is moving very fast and is absolutely everywhere. And I think I'm optimistic about that convergence towards norms, because the agenda is moving so fast and everybody is really trying to get to that same destination.
Thank you, Kate, for this positive message. Let's hope that COP also, this COP will bring us some more positivity on those topics. So, Stephen, what are the challenges that investor multilateral development banks face in climate transition finance? What are the main barriers?
There's lots of barriers, lots of challenges. Every week seems to be exam week, quite honestly. But maybe just pick up on a couple. I mean, it's easy enough to set yourself a policy and a strategy and then try and operationalize it through a framework, and our climate bank framework is still relatively high level. But when you try and actually put that into practice on a nitty-gritty day-to-day basis, then that's where you start to see some issues. I mean, for us in particular at the moment, the adoption of the taxonomy is proving to be quite an issue, and we've got all the other regulations that Kate just mentioned there. As a bank, we're not legally required to actually adopt some of these regulations as an MDB, I mean, but through best banking practice, we're likely to, and we're going to take that decision by the end of the year, hopefully. But clearly in then integrating CSRD, the EIF is subject to the SFDR as well, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation. Then we've got the EBA Pillar 3 disclosures, and all of these things have very specific reporting and disclosure requirements, and not least the ESRS off the back of the templates off the back of the CSRD. And most of this data and information you weren't necessarily collecting before. And of course, we've got the Scope 3 emissions issue to come, and then we have the ISSB standards as well, which we need to be kind of cognizant of. And so we need to actually put in place a system to actually collect that data and use it for the intended purpose, And we as an MDB will actually rely on what our clients can give us by way of data in order to be able to report against the GAR, some of the performance metrics. So this is quite difficult. DNSH in particular from the taxonomy is tough. I mean, it's recognised that quite a few of those criteria you can't really demonstrate compliance with at the moment, so there's some work to be done, and there's the Data and Usability Working Group working on a 2-year mandate under the platform to do that. So this is one challenge we have. And then the second challenge, I guess, is trying to pull the private sector up with the public sector, and also you know, getting full cooperation and buy-in from the FIs. We're trying to kind of look at different ways of doing this. I mean, typically about 40–50% of our lending is to private sector based. So we launched yesterday the Global Green Bond Initiative, where the EIB is kind of leading a set of European DFIs working alongside the Commission, where we will be actually the anchor investor, and we will buy bonds from low and middle income countries, governments issuing these bonds. So we're effectively kind of bringing the public sector to bear, and hopefully we will draw in private sources beyond that. And for that, it will actually be interesting to talk to you at Lux Flag about the labelling aspect of that. And there's a technical assistance program connected with it, which we can find some common ground in, I hope. So there are a couple of the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, with pleasure. We have quite looks like this labeling currently quite a certain number of let's say EIB funded funds out of the impact labels mainly. Thank you. So, Stephen, which solutions have you identified that can help financial institutions to accelerate transition finance?
Well, it's interesting. I'm just fascinated listening to Stephen there for a moment, Isabel. It's, you know, we sometimes don't celebrate the wins in this space, right? Because we're all so focused on the bigger picture, and it does become overwhelming when you're sitting there trying to explain to a friend, and they're looking at you as their eyes glaze over and go, I keep hearing trillions. That's not reality for an individual. But when you actually put it the way Stephen just did it there, you know, what you say, 52% of the book, 48% is then obviously still on top of that Paris line, so everything's Paris lined. That's an incredible win. And Kate used the word pivot, and it's a much used word at the moment, but it's been a very, relatively speaking, quick pivot by the European Investment Bank to be Europe's climate bank under the President's leadership there. And I know he's stepping down shortly, and again, for him as an individual, that's just phenomenal when you think about it. So we're here at COP, we're all talking about the gaps and the needs, but it is great to be in the Benelux pavilion to be actually saying, well, Europeans Bank, Investment Bank, look what it's doing. I think that's something we need to look at as well. If I can frame your question maybe back to solutions and challenges, and Kay was really kind of talking about some of those challenges earlier on. All I do is this area, or all I do is work in this area. I'm overwhelmed on a weekly basis, right? And I'm not on the transaction side per se, and it's just phenomenal when you see, you know, these large institutions struggling, not because they're not trying to do something, they want to do something, but it's just, again, non-stop. So in terms of challenges/solutions, in the report this week of, you know, the 40 odd financial centres globally, obviously data quality and availability is a challenge, but getting better. And I see that Mike Bloomberg and President Macron launched something yesterday about that, so hopefully that will be a big plus, and Commissioner McGuinness is also doing something like that as well. We're seeing the development of standards and guidelines, and Kate mentioned something earlier on. You know, we've got the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, we've got the NGFS, the Sustainable Insurance Forum, we're looking at transition planning now. You've got FSB, you've got IOSCO, and then as UNDP, we provide a secretary to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and you've got the Transition Finance Framework, and we're really looking at all our work through that lens. And yesterday I was at the Asian Development Bank and one of their panels, and ASEAN has now developed a taxonomy and a transition finance frame or guide as well. So we're all moving in the same direction. And I'm showing my age here because I can see there's some younger people in the audience. When I was with the Irish government, I used to be in the mobile technology space, and mobile technology was just emerging. And you would have a phone that the battery would last for a week, which was always phenomenal. You could only text on it or make a call, and Tetris was the game, right? And this is absolutely fantastic, but it was about the interoperability of the different standards across Europe first, because if you went on holiday, the cost of coming back and looking at the bill was sometimes more than your holiday, and then obviously at a global level. And I think that's where we are right now in this area. that interoperability between the different taxonomies and different standards. And I think, as Kate mentioned that as well, policy reg elements, pipeline, you know, not enough of a pipeline for investors or people to bank. And then the ones that are there, and perhaps renewables, are becoming a little bit more expensive because people are now realizing that the pipeline is not there. Innovation, Kate mentioned as well. Perhaps a much abused word, innovation is so broad, but obviously around products and services, we're seeing more financial centres really begin. And I think there's a lab in Luxembourg that's really driving this as well. And then the last one, and you know, we hear a lot about AI and fintech, and obviously that's key, but it's talent development. There's a war for talent in sustainable finance ongoing right now. There are not enough people in the area that understand, but not just at a market level, policymakers and regulators. And so this week alone, we've seen Mike Bloomberg launch a new global capacity building program. The Chinese are going live at CASI on Tuesday as well. And then obviously the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group has got tapped the Technical Assistance Action Plan. So it's great that we're beginning to see now again the focusing on talent development, because all of these challenges will not be overcome if you don't have individuals in the institutions or setting the policy or regulating that actually are on top of the agenda. So they're the challenges. The solutions are, I'll just maybe zone in that talent one. We're going to see a lot more investment from emerging markets, developing economies next 2 years. And if we can scale up the talent development and development of talent in a rapid way, when we do this report in 2 years' time, we'll see a lot more of an impact as well.
Yeah, by chance, you're perfectly right, and I think this is really great to see. I mean, younger people also being more involved, being more interested, and yeah, since we have been the older, let's say.
Yeah. Thanks, Isabel.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks for pointing out how old I am.
I put myself into it, huh?
No,
So,
not at all.
but yeah, let's hope we fill the gaps quite soon. So, thank you. So. Kate, now, what are the most adequate financial instruments to finance low carbon objectives?
Sure. Well, I feel like this is a bit of a trick question because, you know, certainly from what we've seen in the Transition Plan Task Force, talking to many jurisdictions who've come to us to, you know, find out about what we're doing in the UK context and then sharing what they're thinking about, there absolutely is not a one-size-fits-all solution. How to finance transition is extremely you know, different compared to in relation to the cultural and the economic context in which it's happening. So, you know, zooming up to a kind of multilateral level, you know, we've all seen in the last couple of years the development of, you know, JETPs, right? The Just Energy Transition Partnerships, where countries are identifying a transition pathway for themselves and then working with a whole range of different donors, including MDBs, bilateral donors, and private sector donors, to work out how to finance that. And those deals are very bespoke, right? Every country has a different economic transition pathway, and then every kind of sort of financing arrangement that might need to be arranged for that is going to be slightly different. Coming back down to a sort of national jurisdictional level, it's very evident that different governments approach this in very different ways. A huge amount of sustainable finance leadership activity in the regulatory space is happening in Asia and Southeast Asia right now. A number of Southeast Asian countries are really forging ahead, and Stephen mentioned the ASEAN taxonomy. You know, Singapore, which chairs the central banks network, of regulators network at NGFS right now, you know, has been at the forefront of this as well, and a number of others. Each of those countries is doing it slightly differently, and it's not the same as the way that the question is being pursued in Europe, for example. So, wildly overgeneralizing, in Asia, for example, we're likely to see a very prominent role for transition taxonomies. So, you know, attempts to actually specifically define transition activities and then to, you know, set sort of national pathways. And for firms, if you have a combination of a really clear national transition pathways and a taxonomy telling you this is or isn't a transition activity, in our opinion, then you don't necessarily need a transition plan to be a key sort of regulatory tool, whereas in sort of European, sort of more, I guess, Anglo-Saxon type jurisdictions, it's much more a tradition of having a kind of bottom-up market-led approach. And in that context, it makes much more sense to start with the firms and ask the firms to understand what context they're in, define their transition plans, and then out of that will emerge, you know, the the meeting with the National Transition Pathway, but you don't need a taxonomy in the middle telling them what to do. So you will see very different sets of solutions in different contexts. For a firm financing transition, the question is, to some extent, do we actually need specific transition finance tools at all? Obviously, huge efforts have been made into creating like transition bonds and also sustainability bonds, which very often have a high degree of transition in them and quite often are a bit more robust as well so far, and other types of financing instruments. But what we're fundamentally talking about here is core business strategy. You know, going back to TCFD and then through to ISSB, the new ISSB standard, it's very clear that this is not a kind of add-on to the company's core activity. It is the company's core activity. So when a company is raising finance, it should be raising finance for transition. You do not necessarily need it to have a transition finance label on it.
I think that's, yeah, again, I think this is interesting. Let's see, there are good companies doing very well, so we should lead the path. So, Stephen, which financial instruments financing low carbon objectives are you witnessing with the different financial centers?
Great. I'm not on the other Stephen who's actually on the transaction side, but it is interesting.
You can answer as well if you want.
No, but it is interesting, and hopefully you can jump in a moment. But you know what we're seeing, obviously, green has been there for a while now, and you mentioned the Climate Bonds Initiative. Like Sean Kidney should be given a global award, right, in terms of what he's been doing the last number of years. And we claim him to be Irish because he's an Irish passport. But anyway, Sean is a great guy. But what we're seeing the last year or so is social bonds, and we're seeing a lot more interest and a lot more within that, and also in various different discussions. And it's still a little bit maybe immature, but people looking at the conversions around environmental, nature, and social are going to have to eventually get to that point. So social is there. Sustainability linked bonds. We at the UNDP, we've helped 11 countries in the last few years issue $14 billion worth of different bonds, and we've seen SDG bonds. We helped Indonesia earlier on this year issue the first global sovereign blue bond, which is listed in Tokyo, which is super. Obviously, project development capital, funds. Stephen mentioned SFDR. It's interesting to see Article 8, Article 9. And now at the board level, that's been taken very seriously, and how can we utilise it? Blended finance, I think, is something that's going to take off in a big way in the coming years. Green asset purchase program, green credit, and then at the retail level, you're seeing car loans, you're seeing mortgages, and you know I had to address the Irish Credit Union Management Association recently. And there's 200 of these credit unions across the country, and the sport clubs and so on. And going back to that trillions point, we were actually talking about €50,000. How do I retrofit my home? And I was really interested to see the scale. So I think retail is going to really explode in the next number of years. There's an interest at the consumer level. The products are better. The technology is better. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe, Stephen, in terms of...
If you want as well to contribute.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. What's your experience, Stephen, basically, when it comes to the public sector investor in climate projects?
I was just going to pick up on a couple of the points made by Kate, actually. It'd be interesting to see what happens with the CSDDD when that comes in a couple of years' time. Because that's, I understand that's got a mechanism whereby the member states in Europe will actually police, to some extent, the transition plans and somehow form a view on whether they're credible or not. And that takes into account environmental issues, nature and biodiversity, and human rights. So it'll be interesting to see how that opens out. On the EU taxonomy, Stephen there pointed to social taxonomy. I mean, there was a lot of work done on that over the last couple of years, and the bank were part of that. It would be good if that comes back in as well, because I think that has a role to play, and also the transition side of it as well. There was a working group led by one of the bank staff on transition finance. So this is about moving from significantly harmful into that area between green and Paris aligned effectively. I think that's got a role, and that will come back as well. Just on your question, Isabel, I mean, the global stocktake actually in the synthesis report said that deploying public finance is still the best enabler for attracting private sector investment in. There remains an issue of volume, of course. If you look at the Stern-Songway report, we've got to triple and quadruple and seriously increase the amount of public finance that's made available If you just look at the adaptation needs, it's about 10 to 18 times in emerging economies what the whole of climate finance flows at the moment. So the scale of this thing is enormous. And of course, in doing that, we need to make sure that whatever we do finance is impactful. So, for example, we won't finance anything that we don't see to be climate resilient anymore. And the other thing is that we just need to be a little bit more inventive, a bit creative about the financial instruments we deploy. So EIB, of course, is part of CRAFT, which is the Climate Resilience Solutions Fund, which is specifically set up with 500 or so companies to look at interesting and innovative approaches for adaptation resilience. So we need to think a bit laterally. Again, every week is exam week because we're under constant pressure to come up with targets and new ways of doing things. But you know, we've got some great minds, and if we stick together and start using the same terminology on some of this, I think it will kind of accelerate the journey we're on.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot happening at the moment, so I'm pretty sure it's going to be quite challenging, but also very exciting to see all the evolution recently with all what you mentioned. Basically, especially coming from a retail investor, younger consumers as well, maybe more on adaptation, more also some topics are coming back, we would say, from the sustainable development sphere, like gender, human rights, which is very, very nice to see, I would say. So I think it's definitely important and crucial that we focus on those elements. So thank you to the three of you. So let's see if there's any question from the audience.
I have a tricky question, sorry. Apologies in advance. We have recently done a masterclass on biodiversity. And of course, it's a fundamental element. We know there is a biodiversity crisis. I myself mentioned only the climate part. But we have to transition, and in transitioning, our financial institutions, because we're focusing on financial institutions, need somehow to take into account also biodiversity consideration. One key outcome of the masterclass was that whatever is biodiversity, let's say integrating biodiversity, is positive for the climate, might not be the case for upside down, let's say. When we have climate as a focus, we may harm biodiversity. What's your view on that? How do you see, if you see in your work, in all those transition initiatives that you mentioned that are great, whether there is any consideration of biodiversity? We hear a lot about a just transition, fair transition, which is of course a fundamental to be taken into account, but what about the biodiversity? Is it something that you see in your work? Thank you.
Maybe Kate, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I can make a start with this one. And actually, I was in a related discussion yesterday in the WWF Pavilion. It's a very topical theme right now about how climate and nature themes generally interrelate. There is obviously a massive overlap. Nature sort of themes are about the whole environment, and climate is a part of that. And as you say, the environment is an integrated system. We can't just do something in one area that harms the other. That defeats the entire point of the enterprise. But to specifically answer the question, in the Transition Plan Task Force, we, very early on became aware that although that task force had been created in the context of a net zero commitment by the UK government, stakeholders really wanted to know what we were going to do to integrate just transition, adaptation, and also nature, which would include biodiversity. So we created working groups on each of those themes early this year. The Nature Biodiversity Working Group has been, substantially, has had inputs from a whole range of experts, but WWF has played a substantial role in that. And they made recommendations through to the task force. The task force took as many of those into account when publishing its final disclosure framework for transition plans, for climate transition plans, which was published on October the 9th this year. So there are, specific recommendations in there about acknowledging, first of all, in the planning stage around a climate transition for a firm, really understanding the dependencies and impacts around nature, that the firm has. So, you know, what in the natural world does the firm actually depend on to do its business, and what are the impacts that it has? And then to work that through as they do their transition planning as well, exactly to avoid the kind of conclusion you're talking about, where you have a net negative event impact on nature through your climate actions. That's something we'd want to avoid. Ideally, we would have a net positive impact on nature. So we have also published for consultation, and they're still out for consultation, so I'd encourage people to have a look, some deep dive sector guidance pieces for different industry sectors, 7 of them. One of them is food and beverage, which is basically all about land use. And there's a great deal of sort of nature and diversity aspect in that. Of course, they cut through all of the 7 sectors as they do our main framework, but you know, people who are interested in that topic might particularly like to take a look at the food and beverage one, and anyone who would like to take a look at the transition plan task force workshop and respond to our sectoral consultation, we'd warmly welcome that, because we'll finalise those sector guidance pieces in February, and we want to get them right.
Thank you, Kate. Stephen, you wanted to add something?
You cannot separate these points. They're so deeply interrelated. Climate, nature and biodiversity and all the social issues, they're deeply interrelated, and we're seeing that. On the nature and biodiversity side, we've actually been co-leading with the Inter-American Development Bank this year an exercise to try and define what it means, what a nature-positive investment means. And in some ways in Europe, we're lucky to have the EU taxonomy to guide us on that, because you've got the 4 environmental sustainability objectives. It's not quite the same for some of the other MDBs, but we've all kind of aligned around a set of common principles such that we can track and in some cases report what we believe to be nature positive. From our own perspective, our biodiversity standard moved last year from no net loss to no loss of biodiversity, so that was a big step forward from us. We're working very closely with the Commission on how we can look again more with an open mind on financing instruments, and we're starting to engage with certain governments on debt for nature swaps, for example. So the nature agenda is really coming up very quickly. We're probably 10 years behind the climate debate, so we need to accelerate. And it's so useful now that we have the Global Biodiversity Framework to lead us on the 30 by 30 principles and so on. So you cannot just separate them. They're all part of the same thing.
Yes. Stephen?
If I could just build on Stephen's point, and obviously Kate, we can't separate them. But that last point around a decade behind, and I read a LinkedIn post yesterday where somebody said a decade of sustainable finance. And again, it just really struck me that, wow, I've been at this for a decade. It wasn't called sustainable finance a decade ago, but it was just very interesting it was put. But what I'm seeing, and we're seeing at the financial centre level, we've already helped one of our European members develop a nature finance strategy for their financial centre. It's been very interesting. We've seen, again, because I just lived there, but Ireland set up a citizen assembly on biodiversity loss. And they came out with their findings recently, and one of them is the state needs to do more around biodiversity financing. And that's, a very progressive report. And then the last one is, I think what we're seeing is that people are now looking back over the last decade and saying, well, why did it take us so long to do that? And then through the lens of biodiversity saying, actually, we can accelerate there, we can accelerate there. So that decade hopefully will become a 3-year period. But again, it goes back to capacity, it goes back to talent. And if we're only now building out the capacity of sustainable finance, we now need to start building in biodiversity to these programs now, so that somebody comes out and actually goes back to that conversions and saying, I'm not just talking about one element, I'm actually talking about 2. And I've got that as I go develop the product or the service.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say for blue economy is also a bit the same as biodiversity, and it has been there for a while. Yep. It's just because, not only because we are lacking talent, but because maybe there is more awareness now probably, so there is also a bit more commitment and engagement for most of the actors than it was a bit in the past. But hopefully, and let's see if that COP will bring something good this year. So just, I know you, Stephen, you have to leave to go to another panel. You are very successful at this COP. So would you like each of you conclude with a positive word message?
Sorry, forgive me, I do have to dash to another one, so that's why you start with me first. Positive. I'm absolutely shattered. I'm exhausted. It's been a long decade. When I started this, I had a bit more hair. I was half the size. But I can't really put that down to where the last decade has been. But my God, the amount of people I've met who are just fascinating in this journey. And you know what? It's still a relatively small group, right? You'd think, oh, I know that person, but what's really exciting is that group is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the seniority and the power these people have as decision makers. So while I may be tired and shattered, I'm looking forward to the break, the holiday break. But looking forward, it's like Rocky 2, right? Coming out now next year and just really getting stuck in because the momentum is in the right way. Yes, we're having challenging, far right issues. I think in the UK, would it be fair to say that net zero has become the new Brexit or part of it, right?
It's not quite that
Not
bad.
quite there yet, but maybe the media is making it out to be that bad. You saw in Dublin recently, we saw riots a few weeks ago based around immigration, and that was just shocking for me. That wasn't totally unexpected. We're seeing the Dutch elections, talking about climate, and so where do we go? But I am excited because I think there's enough people driving this agenda from a positive way that we're going to see big impacts. And perhaps in a year's time, sitting down with Stephen, as you said, it's not 52%, it's in the 70s, and that's increasing. So I'm excited. And I think at the heart of Europe, Luxembourg has a big role to play in that, and is playing a big role in that.
Thank you, Stephen.
I got a rock, sorry.
Kate?
Yeah, I think Stephen's just apologised to me, and I think it's because he said everything. There you go. My concluding remarks would be sort of similar to Stephen's, but maybe I'll do them the other way round. So Stephen's completely correct. There's a difficult economic and political period ahead of us. There's a huge amount of volatility. We're seeing more pushback. We're seeing, some things that might make the transition more difficult. And we have to acknowledge that actually some of those sort of social and economic forces that are coming up are actually created by the impact of climate change. Part of this is that we're seeing climate change starting to bite. It's not the only reason, but when we look at the underlying causes of inflation and so on, and even of wars and migration around the globe, the climate change is in the mix and will increasingly be so. So that's the more challenging side that Stephen talked about. But I'd also echo the other part that he said. It's like a snowball. I've also worked in this field for quite a long time. And the rate at which things have changed has been very fast and is getting faster and faster, to the point where it now feels a little bit like a kind of transition finance singularity or something. I mentioned, before, there's just the sheer number of simultaneous conversations going on at the same time in the highest forums. 2 years ago, which of us would have thought that the Basel Committee would be consulting on saying that banks should be disclosing climate transition plans and Scope 3 emissions? Nobody. Apart from probably a few people in the Basel Committee who were working on it. But, we're in an extraordinary time. It's moving very fast. As I said before, I am actually optimistic. So I'd like to end with that positive message. I think, there's work to be done, and it always feels like it's not enough, but we are making progress.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. That's very positive. Stephen?
Oh, we're absolutely making progress, and it's exciting to be part of it. It's moving at such a pace. There are so many clever people involved in the thinking around this, and I think we do need to be a little bit careful that we don't all suffer ESG fatigue, because I can see some of that coming in. We need to make sure that we're bringing the right minds into this from the young generation, maybe. My two girls are very conscious of some of this, and that's endemic in their thinking about how they approach things. My hopes for COP28 in particular are that we see the global stocktake, the first one that we had, so it's really imperative that the presidency here tries to forge some concrete actions out of the dire situation that global stocktake actually is showing. And we're all in this. We need to push on, accelerate. Nature and biodiversity, as we say, needs to come up quickly, and the social aspects. We're likely to reach the social tipping points before we reach environmental and climate tipping points. So that somehow needs to come to the front of the agenda, in my view.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, very, very positive as well. So Thank you so much. And I think we are quite proud also in Luxembourg that the Luxembourg sustainable ecosystem is also quite driving it, and we are part of it, and we are very, very, very pleased to see that also thanks to VIB. So thank you so much for joining, for
Pleasure.
your insightful message and positive ones. So thank you. I wish you a great time at COP, and hope we meet in less than 10 years to see what will have happened by then.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Thank you.